Thank you. Thank you, Chair, ever so much for that introduction. Thank you for the invite to be here. It's lovely. Those seats used to squeak as well. It's lovely. I first lectured in here, and I was taking over the teaching of a formidable man who was just retiring called Peter Haggart. And he had 2-hour lectures. And I didn't realise he had 2-hour lectures because he had so much to get through. And so my memories of this room are, how on earth am I going to talk for 2 hours to these students? So I'll try and get over that fear of the place. I got my first teaching assessments here. I don't know if the academics in the room, most don't read the assessments that students write. But this was the assessment that had the most effect on me in my whole life, was that Dr. Dorling clearly doesn't care. That's all they'd written. No. And in a sense, I was your standard young Bristol geography academic. I was trying to write research papers and books, and the teaching was something you kind of had to do. But in particular, I was useless at structuring my lectures, which is really annoying. I now know I am, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to carry on being somewhat unstructured. But here's the structure. This is what you're going to get in about 45 minutes. You're going to get 34 slides. You are on a questionnaire I was sent on Monday. Then you're just going to get 12 on this book, some pictures from it, and just a couple of conclusions. So there is a structure, if it doesn't appear to be that way. Here's the survey. Here's the email. Literally this Monday, so you can see when I was thinking of putting this together. Dear Dr. Dorling, we'll be very grateful if you consider participating in our international survey of climate scientists. So I was deeply honoured to be called a climate scientist. I'm not a climate scientist, but I work in a building with many of them. And you may have received these kind of emails. I'm one of those annoying people who occasionally actually does fill in these surveys. But as you'll see, I'm a bit sarcastic. I don't try to be horrible. It's gone through the New England Human Research Ethics Committee, you'll be glad to know, and it's got a number. So what does the survey look like? The survey begins with, a series of personal questions, so I'm skipping those about my job and age and so on. And then the first one is, do I agree with the IPCC's findings that anthropogenic climate change is occurring and presents a threat to the planet? And I click no, and there's my slightly sarcastic answer. I had a typo in it, so it will make no sense to them. But you've got a sense of what I could be like. Now, these questions, you could actually skip in the survey, so you could say you didn't want to fill them in. But other questions you couldn't skip. And let's go forward. These are the questions you couldn't skip. So the only way of actually seeing what's in this survey, even if I didn't want to answer all the questions, was just to press strongly agree on everything. So it's not that I strongly agree on everything that you're about to see, it's just I wanted to know what else was in the survey. But whenever you're doing a survey like this, let people skip. Otherwise, they will just fill in things that are meaningless. And there will probably be a paper from this survey that will say that climate scientists, this percentage exactly strongly agree. And of course, that will include me. So to what degree do I agree that I employ these methods in my own life? That I concentrate on the ways in which climate change can be solved? I seek out other people to talk about climate change because I worry about it, and I think about the best ways to handle climate change. You could think about how you might answer this yourself. I know there are climate change scientists in the room. Do I ask my colleagues how they control their climate change related emotions? Do I tell others how I feel about climate change? Do I try to get advice from someone about what to do with these emotions? Do I distract myself from avoiding thinking about it? I'm trying to get you to think about crises and things that you may worry about. Do I refuse to believe that climate change is happening? I click strongly agree, but I do think climate change is happening. I just wanted to get through and see what else they're going to ask. Do I pretend it's not happening? Do I avoid thinking entirely? What possible opinions might I have about working in my organisation? So you'll have had these anyway. Please indicate the degree of agreement or disagreement with each statement. My organisation values my contribution to its well-being. Well, the University of Oxford may or may not. I'm sure quite a lot of my colleagues really hate the fact I work at the University of Oxford. Others might like it. What is the organisation? I'm not trying to answer that. My organisation fails to appreciate my extra effort from me. The organisation would ignore any complaint that I made. The organisation really cares about my well-being. Even if I did the best job possible, the organisation would fail to notice it. The organisation cares about my general satisfaction in work. The organisation shows very little concern for me. The organisation takes pride in my accomplishments at work. Please read the statements below and select which responses best describe how you feel. I should have given you the context. This is an American survey gone around the world, but you have to remember they are in the shock of the first few weeks of the current government in the USA. So I'm not being too sarcastic about it. Think about it from that point of view. But we're asking climate change scientists, or other people are, have they found a meaningful career? Is your work contributing to personal growth? Click on whether your work makes no difference to the world. To what extent your work contributes to life's meaning. These are fairly kind of existential questions for a survey, which I think was supposed to take about 15 minutes when I read the first email. And it carries on. I've got a good sense of making my job meaningful. My work makes a positive difference in the world. My work helps me better understand myself. Do I know that? You may recognize some of these questions. If you ever ask these by your GP, it means you're being asked, do you need to have the pills that'll make the day easier? I discovered that work has a satisfying purpose. My work helps me make sense of the world around me. It serves a greater purpose. Select the responses that best describe how you feel. How often do you feel tired? How often are you physically exhausted? How often are you emotionally exhausted? How often do you think I can't take it anymore? How often do you feel worn out? How often do you feel weak and susceptible to illness? I do wonder, as I chair an ethics committee, quite what the New England Ethics Committee thought as they thought we're going to send this round to people. Please tick the box that best describes your experience over the last 2 weeks. Being optimistic, felt useful, felt relaxed. Been dealing with problems well, thinking clearly, I felt close to people, being able to make up my own mind about things. Do you feel worn out at the end of the working day, exhausted? Do you think every working hour is tiring? Do you have enough energy for your families and friends? Over the last 2 weeks, have you been feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge, not being able to stop or control your worrying too much, feeling afraid? Now remember, we're thinking about crises. Are you unable to stop thinking about future climate change and global environmental problems? Unable to stop thinking about past events related to climate change? Unable to stop thinking about losses to the environment? Do you have difficulty sleeping? Do you have difficulty enjoying social situations with family or friends? Do you have difficulty working or studying, feeling anxious about the impact of your personal behaviours on the earth, feeling anxious about your responsibility to address environmental problems, feeling anxious about your personal behaviours to do little to fix the problem? I'm partly going through this just to show you that if you didn't, by the time I start going through all these possibilities with you, you're going to be feeling fairly anxious about things. And if we want to know what it is that worries people, it isn't necessarily the best way to give them a list of things that are really worrying and saying, how worried do you feel now? Please read the following questions and response best describes how you feel. That's the emotionally exhausting, burnout, does your work frustrate you? And then a whole load more. I'm going to zoom on because we can't take the whole time with this survey. Finding it hard to wind down, dryness in your mouth. Can't experience any positive feeling at all. Difficulty breathing. Difficult to take up the initiative to do things. I overreact to situations. I'm trembling in the hands. Lots of nervous energy. I worry about situations in which I might panic and make a fool of myself. Panic attacks. I have nothing to look forward. I'm getting agitated. I find it difficult to relax. I'm downhearted and I'm blue. I'm intolerant and that's kept me from getting on. I'm close to panic. Can't become enthusiastic about anything. I'm not worth much as a person. I'm rather touchy. I'm aware of my heart as the absence of physical exertion, missing a heartbeat. Some people do. I felt scared without any good reason. I felt that life was meaningless. The following questions, I haven't edited it. This is simply how the survey came on Monday morning to me. The following questions relate specifically to the knowledge and understanding that you as a climate scientist have about the state of the world. These answers may be quoted if you give your permission to do so, but not in any way that will identify you. Right? So I've just outed myself if they ever quote these. How helpful are you about the future? I'm 100. As I've written at the bottom, there always is a future. There will be one. And then I'm I'm kind of not proud of this. I'm outing myself. But if you wonder who are the kind of people, what makes me hopeful, and I quote, and I'll let you read it, I won't read it out, but there's Noel Castry writing in 2022, famous geographer, quoting from Flackler's Havel about the meaning of hope versus optimism, and so on. And maybe I'm not being helpful, but I have just been working for 2 years on a book about what worries people and how do you ask people about what worries them. And I don't think this is necessarily the best way. I could do the same thing for you with nuclear war. And in fact, if we ask the right set of questions about nuclear war, a majority of people in the world are petrified that we're about to go to nuclear war and were before what has recently occurred between Ukraine and Russia. Anyway, any eagle-eyed people, hopefully you've got towards the bottom of that. One of the nicer things that Noel's written, I thought, it was in a footnote. How worried are you about the future? And there's me again being sarcastic. I don't worry because we're going to have a future. It's not a specific enough question. What worries you about the future? And now become serious. You know. Somebody I love is harmed or die. That's probably my biggest worry about the future. What are you thinking of when you produce a survey like this? What actual answers do you think you're going to get? What doesn't worry me about the future? Are there things that others worry about that you don't need to worry about at all? Well, okay, I've just spent 2 years worrying about surveys about what people worry about. And so I write where the list is extremely long of the things I don't worry about. I'm privileged. I'm a university academic. Often we say as academics how terrible our jobs are. But honestly, the lovely thing about being a social scientist who looks at inequality is there are quite a lot of people out there on the planet who've got it rather worse than we have. Just put it that way. I live in a rich country at a time of relative peace. You may not think this is a time of relative peace, but compared to most of the last 2 or 3 centuries, it is quite incredible. I try to understand what others worry about, but a great amount is beyond me to grasp, and you're going to need a bigger box if you want me to complete the list to answer your question. How do you think you are affected by your knowledge of climate change, emotionally, socially, and otherwise? I thought this was quite an interesting question. As compared to when I was at school, when we were taught that the world was cooling. I mean, I'm old enough to have had to write about the Ice Age coming to get a grade at A-level geography. So although there were people who knew the world was warming before then, we were teaching it was cooling. A lot of things have occurred in my life in the half century since I was first taught about the Ice Age to come. I've been like the frog in the kettle over learning about climate change. It affects me socially because I try to be careful about other people's feelings. Some will not care, some will care hugely. I'm not that careful in terms of what I've just done with you lot, but I am obviously very aware. I work in the School of Geography and Environmental Science. We have at least 100 climate change researchers in my school. We have the lead author of the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degrees. It affects me in other ways. It's existential. It means I actually bother to complete surveys like this. Right? Most surveys you get, you won't click on. Have you or anybody you know received threats or political attacks related to my work? Yes. Mostly not on climate change. But on climate change, I actually have had a lot of letters, so I do feel sorry for some of the physical geographers. I've had people trying to convince me it's not real. That is much less now than it used to be. I have a weird habit of always replying to people who write me hate mail if they give an address and talking back with them. I wouldn't recommend this. I'm a white man. It is much easier if you're a white man to engage with people being nasty. I do it mainly to get their postcode. Most of the hate stuff I get is about racism, and don't I realise that Britain should be a white place, and the immigrants are terrible. And I want to get the postcode because invariably they live in a little village where everybody is white to do this. The worst one I had, or most interesting one, was being told that the satellite data which showed that the Earth wasn't warming, and I got them to send me the satellite data and I plotted it and the Earth was warming. So you have to ask yourself, how can people feel so strongly about some things? Is there anything else you would like to say that we haven't asked about? Again, a sarcastic and probably not very funny answer to an American sitting in New England. Would I take part in a Zoom interval? No, I've just decided not to. I think they've heard enough from me, and they don't do it. So, that's by way of introduction, like one set of worries. Within universities, climate change will probably be the greatest worry. When we survey young adults who have got university degrees across Europe, we find climate change as the biggest worry. But as you might not be surprised, it is not the largest worry for the majority of people in the world, by which I mean the majority of the world's middle class, because the poorer half of the world's population are hardly ever surveyed and don't fill in surveys. There's some people writing some nice things about this. So you can see the company I keep. I'm not sure if George Monbiot read the book, because he might not agree with it, but he might have done, and he tends to. Crises. And I'm afraid you're going to get graphs for about 15 minutes and then a conclusion, okay? Because my lazy, unstructured way in which I talk about the book is, because the graphs are always the hardest work, is I show you what it's based on. The word crisis. We didn't used to talk about crises very much when we lived in the midst of them. You're often told that the number of pandemics is going up. It's actually going down. This city is great, actually, for typhoid, cholera, incredible accounts of all the pandemics that swept through Bristol. In the last 70 years, never been fewer. This is worldwide. We have fewer and fewer deadly pandemics in the world. It may sound ironic, having said that we're still in the COVID pandemic. The one before that was AIDS, 1918 flu, but they're really spaced out now. Endless wars in Europe. Yeah, absolutely impossible to memorize or list the number of wars and the crises. It's been a time of relative stability and peace since 1945. Kind of ramps up with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Crisis is in the name. And I do wonder a little bit about whether we are in a kind of omni-crisis now, because we have the luxury to think about crises, because almost all of you, but not all, almost all of you are going to be well fed tonight. You've got a good home that's warm enough to sleep in. You're going to come to a job tomorrow. Your family are mostly okay, but you worry. Everybody worries. But now we don't have the kind of things that most people in the past had to worry about. And you could argue, this is from our World in Data. I was involved in a little thing called World Mapper, and our World in Data showed how to do it properly. This is our World in Data, showing how we shouldn't worry about poverty anymore, because it's disappearing. And that green bit is all the people who are not poor in the world. So look at how wonderful the world is. So why do we worry? As you can tell, I'm not very impressed by the Our World in Data graph or interpretation. Our World in Data is produced by economists. So apologies to economists in the room, but economists have a particular way of looking at things which sometimes can look very, very odd. There are, after the introduction, 6 chapters in the book, named chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And this is the structure of it. What I do is I take the Ipsos Mori surveys, which have been taking place every month for many, many years. The number of countries in the world is increasing, but it's over 30. It now includes China. It didn't, but luckily the Institute of Social Sciences in China also carried out a survey, at least since 2012. The survey includes India, it includes Brazil, it includes South Africa, but not much else in Africa. It includes most of Europe, North America, Canada, Japan, Korea. And I look at the survey as a whole, I look at the changes over time, but most importantly, I look at what is persistently the top concerns for people. And the wording is, what are the 3 following topics do you find the most worrying in your country? Now, you can test the wording. If you'd said for the world, it might be different to your country. Or if you said for you, it might be different. But there are many other surveys. There are many surveys just of Britain about what concern people. And they're pretty consistent about what people are actually concerned about. There were 18 things they asked about. That's too many to write chapters of. So I've combined them into those 6 groups. And I've combined them in such a way that we elevate climate change and threats to the environment a bit, because I'm involved in geography and I can't write a book without them. They do change a bit. The biggest change was cost of living and inflation rose up in recent years as inflation rose up a year, 18 months into the pandemic. The one which is second, almost as important, and was more important before, for about a decade, was poverty and social inequality. And you may think that strange, but it really has been up there. 10 years ago, before then, it was unemployment. These are the concerns of most people. I think academics have actually had an effect on this. A book called The Spirit Level was published in 2010, and there was other work, and I think it actually has pushed understanding of poverty and social inequality up. But inflation, inequality and poverty, unemployment, crime and violence, corruption, healthcare, taxes, then climate change, education, coronavirus, always coming down, but there. Immigration control, more decline, military conflict, threats, maintaining social programs, rise of extremism, terrorism, access to credit. The graph isn't completely smooth because I was trying to do something clever and show change at the same time, but the key thing is the order. This really is what you get when you ask people without having first scared them about a particular thing. You know, if you asked other questions, it will alter people's worries. We're all worried about something. Maybe we vary usually individually in terms of how much we are carefree and how much we're a worrier. But we all have worries. They tend to be quite personal about ourselves and our families. We don't generally wander around Park Street going, what is happening to unemployment in Britain? So this is figured by asking these questions. I'm going to show you a slide, occasionally 2 for each chapter, and then I'm going to conclude. I put the first 2, by far the biggest, together: cost of living, inflation, and poverty. This is a worry about having enough. People actually having enough. Almost everybody here, apart from the students, is in the top 10% of British society. That's all our academic grades. We're in a group that takes 40% of all income every year. We leave the other 90% of people in this country to live off 60% of national income. Right? That's why we tend not to worry about poverty and inequality so much. The second one I'm going to show, and this is where I've combined these, is unemployment and issues of immigration control, because I think they're linked. I think the fear of immigration is often linked to they are coming for our jobs, British jobs for British workers and so on. The third chapter, chapter 4 in the book, crime, violence, war, terrorism, and a few other things that maybe don't neatly fit in, but I wanted to lump them all together. By the way, we have answers to these geographically. So you can suddenly see when Romania and Poland begin to get really worried about war when there's a war right next to them. Right? It's interesting to watch and see them go down. The fourth chapter, chapter number 5, Cradle to Grave, is all about the state. Healthcare. Healthcare, incidentally, the greatest fear in China. Will there be enough healthcare? Will it be adequate? Not written down in the survey, but will I have enough money to bribe my way if I need to bribe my way for my family to get healthcare? Or in a population that's this old and getting older, what's going to happen with healthcare in the future? Or because everything else is working so well and we've had a huge improvement in living standards, the biggest improvement in the history of the world, from taking people out of poverty to a comfortable life, and we're not yet concerned about inequality greatly because it's relatively recent and all of us are richer than we used to be. And we're not too worried about things like war, and we're certainly not worried about crime because there's hardly any. Then healthcare rises to the top in a place like China. Then we're going to get climate crisis, and then biodiversity affects the environment. So, and remember, these are the major worries. The cost of living. What's wrong with the graph? The graph puts everybody between somebody living on $2 a day and Musk in the same group. You don't feel okay if you've got $2 or $3 a day to live on. Right? It's a silly graph. I'm just showing you in the middle there the world in data graph drawn another way. If I've got one aim for this book, it's to get my friends in the University of Oxford who produce our world in data to take that graph off their website, the one that says that poverty's been eliminated. Because you can't have a situation in which we survey the population of the world and they tell us this is the biggest problem, and a website telling you it's gone away. The interesting thing is when did that measure drop? And you can see the bars there. This is using the data from our world in data. And the drop coincides really, really well with the drop in the number of children people had worldwide from 1968. And if you suddenly have fewer children really, really rapidly, you will end up with fewer poor families. It doesn't mean anything else has much changed. You can debate the amount of going hungry. We, by the way, in this country have as many people going seriously hungry now as we did in the 30s. You know, there are other ways of looking at it. But I'm skipping on because I'm going to get on to the end. That first crisis is all about, will I have enough to get by? Do others around me have enough to get by? The second is about sharing the work. Will I be made unemployed? That quote should resonance with you. That's an email I received in 2023 from a colleague of my age in another university. As you know, this is ramping up and up in the UK, but not just in the UK. So you can get a sense of the fear of unemployment now in British universities. It was harder to do that 10 years ago, 20 years ago in the boom. Unemployment rates at any one time may be low, but that doesn't mean that people aren't made unemployed and have to get another job again if they can. Almost any job, because we have the lowest unemployment benefits almost in Europe in this country, but I'm not talking about Britain. These are, these graphs are for Britain, but these are global issues. But fear of unemployment rides higher in the minds of most middle-class people in the world, over average pay, than the climate, than what's going to happen to the climate. It's, will I be needed? What happens if I'm not needed? The line graph and the bar graph are identical. Just showing you the data in two different ways. These four issues were the most salient for many years in the UK. And you can see a brief period just before the Brexit referendum where immigration actually topped on this particular scale. Immigration was the most salient issue in the British elections study for all elections for years apart from 2010, just after the financial crisis, where the economy just pipped it. Immigrants don't get rid of jobs, by the way, they create them. If people turn up in Bristol from outside the UK, that creates a need for more teachers, it creates a need for more corner shops, it creates more jobs. But that isn't necessarily how you may feel about it. And my point that I'm trying to get over is it's really salient. These are the biggest fears. First of all, will I and those around me have enough to get by? Secondly, will I lose work? Or will my children get a job? The third one, now it's largely about crime, but what I'm showing you here is war. There are some very nice folk in Sweden who meticulously add up all deaths in the world that can be attributed to war in one way or another, and have done so consistently since 1989. So the map in the middle is the world shaped by all deaths in war since 1989. I probably shouldn't say this in public talks about this. I'm partly hoping you're going to tell me what things not to say. But apart from Rwanda, it looks a little bit like a crusade to me. You know, these wars were largely not started or funded by the places where they died. These are wars involving superpowers and arms from superpowers who've just decided that people in those countries can be killed. Right? Even when officially it's a civil war, there's always backing from somewhere else. There are lots of idiosyncrasies in the global Ipsos. Ipsos, by the way, produced the best polling, if you wonder why I'm using them. They're the most reliable pollsters in the UK. Crime and violence is at the top, has been at the top for 2 years in Sweden, which may surprise you if you don't know. There's been some gang violence in Stockholm. You've got the quote from the Swedish Prime Minister there, saying Sweden has never before seen anything like this. No other country in Europe is seeing anything like this. So you can suddenly have something that comes to the fore and is an issue. The reason I've got the graph of inequality is the work in Sweden suggests it's actually a small rise in inequality in Stockholm is more closely associated with the rise of violence in Stockholm than immigration. The more complicated graph over there is just my nerdiness you can look at things like births. The births are at the top. They're going from 1750 to 1910. All of Europe discovered the condom around about 1880. See the effect of discovering the condom? Or it was known about, but it wasn't known about widely enough. And fewer baby Swedes, fewer Swedes leave Sweden. Why do you have immigration to Sweden now? It's because for many, many decades, you don't have enough people that would actually replace you. And these things are very, very predictable and very closely related. We had a fall in people being born in the 30s in the UK. We went out, and to be exact, it was Enoch Powell who went out to India and the Caribbean and asked people to come and work in the NHS and on the buses. People who were born in the 1930s, but in India and the Caribbean. Right? Rich countries like Sweden and the UK make up deficits in their numbers of children with immigrants. And when they have, or in the past, had more children, less spaces for people coming in. But not something you can control, other than controlling how many babies you have. Right? Immigration controls do not stop immigration. They simply change where people come from. We've only got 3 more to go. Worries about services, health service, education service, occasionally housing. It often isn't the countries where things are worse, where people worry the most. My favourite one in the surveys are just how positive people in India are about how great India is doing, which shows an amazing achievement of the Modi government to convince the population that everything is great in India. This graph just shows you about the state of the United States. The first one is from the Atlantic. It's your chances of dying by age compared to other rich countries. So on the day you're born in the US, you're twice as likely to die. By the time you're age 30, you're 4 times likely to die that year than if you were in most European countries. It's not until you get to 100 that you've kind of back to normal, but you know, if you ever talk to somebody aged 100, tell them they're probably going to make it to 101, probably not 102, or they'll maybe be more subtle. The middle graph is showing just how bad the USA is. Remember, the USA spends more money on health than anywhere else. But the best graph is John Byrne Murdoch's, which is the far one. We have some of the worst health outcomes now in Europe, in the UK. But we do better for health. Our top 1%, which is a tiny little open dot at the top of the England one, live just as long as the top 1% in the USA. If you want to think of the top 1% of the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, 5 of them stood behind Donald Trump on his inauguration, 5 of the richest 7 men on the planet. And they worry about germs, and they might have all kinds of things to try to live forever. They don't live any longer than we do in England. And we don't live as long as people in most of Europe. These are just concerns about basic services that you're going to rely on. And they're a major concern of people in the world. I delve into other things. I really like conspiracy theories. There are surveys of conspiracy theories to see how many people believe conspiracy theories. The fun thing of the surveys of conspiracy theories is that there was one published in 2021. Inevitably, one of the things that's tested turns out to be true. In this case, it was that there was Russian government involvement in the election of Trump. It probably isn't a conspiracy theory to believe that. And that, of course, makes people who believe in conspiracy theories believe them even more when they find out that some conspiracy theories might not be conspiracy theories. This is the most contentious one. The question was, would you say the following statement is true or false? Regardless of who is officially in charge of governments and other organizations, there is a single group of people who secretly control events and rule the world together. Least popular in Japan, but still a fifth of Japanese people think it. 4/5 of people in Nigeria think this. Now, I think what YouGov were getting at was the kind of Illuminati kind of conspiracy theories, but you've got to be careful of your question wording. You know, there are people who meet on yachts. There's always Peter Mandelson there, but you know, the others are. There are people who meet on yachts and make decisions about the world. You know, don't tend to do it in public. Right? Decisions to go to war are made between presidents and prime ministers, and occasionally Parliament might be allowed to join in or not. But you know, if you were just to look at that question, you might well think, well, yes, things are made in secret. Finally, climate crisis. Concern about climate crisis is falling. Has now been falling for a number of years. It's fell most obviously in 2024. And the question is why? And I think it's exposure to being told. It's like crying wolf. So many stories about weather events being associated and so on, that when people have other things in their lives as well to worry about, it's actually gradually going down the agenda. Now, when I tell my colleagues in my department about some of this, one reaction they have is, oh, people are just being asked the wrong question. It's framed wrong. Almost suggesting the question should be, climate change is the most important thing about our future. You know, do you agree? Very yes, yes, or a little bit yes, kind of. I'm being unfair to my colleagues, but they just think people are ignorant. And I find it hard. I find it hard to think that really is the case. Unbelievable inequalities in who's contributing to climate change. So it's incredibly closely associated with inequality. People who believe climate change is a hoax. We are the world leaders in actually knowing that climate change isn't a hoax. Thanks to the BBC, thanks to Sky, thanks to a coalition between the political parties that sometimes gets on the edge of breaking, and might now not to say that it's a hoax. So we are at the bottom of that graph. Nigeria is at the top. You know, they're lying to us. Nigeria largely means Lagos, and if you were in Lagos and experiencing Lagos day by day, you might well think there are lots of things going really bad in the world, and they're lying to me. But there are other issues that I think matter. There's been meticulous collection of data, comes under EMDAT, funded by the UN, I think, on the number of people affected by climate-related events. Now, in the past, this is based on reporting in newspapers. In the 1950s and 60s, there were the people who died in floods and storms and other climate-related event heat waves, where it won't have been too well reported because our international news network wasn't that well. So if there's any bias in this, it's undercounting. And the figures, remember the data gets better over time, are that in the 1950s, of everybody alive, each year, 77 million were dying due to climate-related disasters. Drops to 51, 14, still 14 in the 80s, down to 6, 5, 2, and 1 person per million per year so far in the 2020s. Those are the people who die in the floods in Nigeria, in the floods in Pakistan, extensive floods in Pakistan, but the number of deaths was probably equal to the number who would have died of COVID in 2 or 3 days in Pakistan. Because we've got really good at early warning. People have got mobile phones, they know about move to high ground, so you can have more severe weather events. You can have hotter heat waves, you can have floods which are larger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that more people die. In fact, the opposite. I'm trying to understand what is it that means that climate change is reducing as far as people are worried about it. People affected is measured per 1,000, and it's not such a big drop-off, but it is a drop-off. Skipping over that, but just to try to give you an idea about why it might be. And it is a problem. The better you adapt, the more concerned you are, the more you have warnings about hurricanes and other things, the more you have systems in place to ship food to places where disaster has happened, the more you can cope with a climate that's becoming more unpredictable. Biodiversity, which you could step back and say, actually, this is the biggest crisis. Forget climate change. 200 or 300 years from now, we'll probably be cooling again. It's hard to imagine we'll still be extracting what's left of the gas and the oil and burning it. But all those species that we've helped made extinct in the 6th largest extinction, they're not coming back. So if you are stepping back from everyday problems and everyday life, you might say that the biggest issue is biodiversity and general threats to the environment. And what you have there, and it's just a small section of the book, is there is a really interesting, not that niche still, literature out there saying catastrophe is just around the corner. We need to dramatically change our way of life overnight. My favourite one is this one because he actually put dates on it. And you can see we've passed 2020 about how the population is about to collapse because of what we're doing to the planet. And then there's another one about what we need to do for one planet living. I think those things distract. I think they're wrong, but I think they actually take up all the space. I've got a very long quote, so I'm putting this up early. I've got to stop in a minute. I think this is the kind of reasonable quote. It's far too long, but it basically says, it is possible to live within limits and live a good life and live in homes which are heated at 20 degrees and have enough water at least for a shower, if not a bath, for everybody, for 10 billion people, and get the emissions down and cool. It is possible. Of course, the question is, how do you get to that? But actually saying it is possible is a start, rather than saying we're doomed and you never know around the corner, because of course you never do know. The North Atlantic drift may end, we may be plunged, the tundra will melt, and so on. It doesn't get you action, whereas saying it is entirely possible to have a much better planet and actually be emitting far less into the atmosphere, I think is better. But I promise you the end and some questions. Conclusion, what's going on? They're all related. I'm not actually going to tell you mainly what I think the next crisis will be, because that's the kind of teaser, and there's no reason why I should get it right, but they're all related. The major crisis in most people's concern in the world, the cost of living, poverty and inequality, is related to excessive consumption, because the money the poor do not have is being spent by the rich on planes and super yachts and houses and ways of living that are the most destructive to the planet. And if the poor had a little bit more of it, they would not emit anything like as much. Here's sociology, different from economics. The frequency of mentions of the word equality in a leading social science journal. And I won't tell you about the last one, that's the pandemic. And my last slide, so please think of a question. But I'm giving you most of the answer because I don't expect most of you to ever read the book. So here's the answer. And the answer really is Thomas Piketty, and a much shorter, better book, which is his Nature, Culture and Inequality book, 2024. Famously, nobody read Piketty's enormous book. They all bought it, did really well. Nobody read it. That little book, Nature, Culture and Inequality, is just magnificent. It's short, it's tiny, it's practical. The solutions to all of these problems, problem of not having enough, problem of not being needed, problem about your health services, problem about war, they've been around for a long time, much longer than when this banner was made in 1914. Right? It's a question of getting together and implementing them, and the extent to which you do. And some countries in the world implement them more than others. Other countries are currently taken over by people who don't believe any of this, but luckily don't believe any of this so obviously that at least you can see what happens if you do let them be in control. And finally, it's interesting to be here because those billionaires who've just won the United States, they don't really want Panama, they don't want Mexico, they don't want Canada, they don't want Greenland. They don't even necessarily want the rare earths, or as Trump calls it, the raw earths in Ukraine. What they want is the UK. So we're currently the next prize for them. And if you want one idea of the next crisis, very locally, it's becoming the 51st state. But globally, that really doesn't matter, because we're only a small part of the world. Thank you very much for letting me overrun. Please think of a couple of questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Danny, for that nice excellent topic combined typhoid and human geography together, and also the global perspective and UK perspective together. So here we've got maybe 10 minutes for questions. Anyone got any questions for now?
So you mentioned the great Professor Haggis, and shortly before he retired in geography, and this is true, a newsletter went out to all the former students, edited by one Paul Longley. And in that newsletter, it actually contained a plea for money, and the money was to fund a replacement post for Peter Haggis, framed as someone who'd be a lecturer in health geography. Yeah. I'd imagine that raised about £2.50, and I'm just wondering, are you the person they bought? I don't think that was the plan. I just think I turned up at the point when he was not. Tony Hall in the back will actually know the answer. Will tell me later what actually occurred. What Tony did do is tell me. I can say now he's retired. Don't worry about the university paperwork. As long as you use exactly the same name for the course and so on, you can do whatever you like in it. Which was the beginning of my education in how to be an academic. Yeah.
I'll kick things off. First of all, I will contradict you. I have read almost all of Catherine's books.
Excellent.
But it is one of the most unread books. I've said that. What's possible is not the same as what's achievable. And so, yeah, sure you can have a discourse about what's possible, but if it is actually beyond your reach, beyond your capability, I don't think it's necessarily very useful.
Yeah, I agree. Utopian dreams. Well, we've had enough kind of them. You know, we've had 200 or 300 years of utopian dreams to see them. The reason I'm optimistic is the biggest thing occurring for us, in my point of view, is this unbelievable drop in our reproduction. So for the first time in the species, we're looking at human population peaking in 2084. Young people, particularly in rich countries, are no longer being produced. It's extremely difficult to make a profit as a company when your global market is getting smaller. So my optimism is you can keep capitalism going, you can burn up the planet as long as you've got more customers all the time. But when you've got fewer customers, and also when you're educating them all and telling them what's going on, the ability to fool them and to keep on going this way, not in the interest of most, becomes harder and harder. So it's a different circumstances. We're not going to get a utopia. We're not going to get, I'll put it up because it's much more interesting than mine, so you can read their quote. You know, we're not going to get that. Probably not. Hopefully I could be wrong, but you know, we will get more wars, barbarism. But the way that births are going, we probably aren't going to get 10 billion for long. Like, nowhere are they going up. That every time the UN publishes on the number of babies being born in the world, it's less than what they'd predicted earlier. Yeah.
I mean, to be
yeah.
optimistic,
Yeah.
you have to think that humans are rational. And, you know, I think the evidence suggests that's not the case.
Yeah, so the big worry is that we are completely unable to organise ourselves out of a hunter-gatherer group of 100 people, which we've evolved to do all out of a village, which we had enough of evolution in villages to mean that we're quite good at hierarchy and so on, and we know our place and we organise in that. And cities are relatively new. There's a sense in which we're going to find out, but we can't say we definitely are not able to create cities and operate on this level. But for most of the population living in cities, this is relatively recent. It's just a few generations. There are other enormous changes. A century ago, all the women in this room would have been seen as subhuman. You wouldn't have been here. So there are utterly unpredictable good things that are occurring. But it might be beyond us. And there are some of us who want to take ourselves to other planets to carry on expanding, you know, which... but I don't find enough examples of us being immensely stupid. You can, but I think Easter Island is understandable. I think you can look at all the collapses that have occurred and say, I saw how that happened. But I am very much a glass half full.